more because I am an early riser, and we are live. Excellent. Okay, so guys, welcome to Affirmative Interaction. We are back after just a couple of weeks for a break. A lot has happened, and I think we were not going to come back until inauguration. But we thought, the country almost broke in half, so we might as well talk about it. We do want to welcome Matthew to the show. Matthew, hello. Feel free to introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Mattew Shallenberger. I am a pastor. I'm the associate pastor of the Ultra Adventist Church in Tennessee. My wife, Emily, and I have two little boys, Malachi and Eli. They are 7 and 5 years old. They keep us busy. As you can tell from my background, I'm a musician. Mm-hmm. So I play piano, keys, guitar, and bass.
Oh, well, I have to ask then, because I've been listening to a lot of just jazz recently. So, I mean, just in general, as a musician, what is your favorite song to play off the top of your head?
Oh, I would have such a hard time answering that. I don't know if I have like favorites. I could give you like a list of favorites maybe. Mm-hmm. But man, it's hard to think of one off the top of my head. I really like taking like hymns and kind of like reworking them into like maybe more contemporary or modern style. Mm-hmm. So I really like the hymn "I Must Tell Jesus." That's a good one.
Good, excellent.
I like to call them herns now.
Oh, somebody help Logan. So speaking of Logan, it's good to see you, my friend. Congratulations on the new job. I've heard you've been struggling to find a lunch to bring. So if anyone has recipes that you want to give Logan for his lunch at work, feel free. Logan, how has the job been?
I literally don't start until time paperwork. I'm working in, like, if anyone wants to know, I'm working in a cabinet and installation and education. Something a little different. I still live in a church, which is what I'm currently in, but I decided to kind of follow in my father's footsteps and kind of go construction for a little bit, something I enjoy. And so I'm excited to start tomorrow. I do have a favorite song, just to piggyback off of Matthew, that I play, and it's the only song I know on piano. It's "This Is My Father's World." Yeah. And I learned it, and I played it for Sabbath school when I was like 8 for like the adult Sabbath school, and I messed up so bad. And I walked off mid-performance, and I told the woman that day at church that I quit. I was never coming back to lessons again, and I've never played piano again. But that's the one I remember. I can play it perfectly now. So,
boy, that story took a turn, man.
I'm out. You talked me into this, and I do not. And then I learned the saxophone, but yeah.
Excellent. And I just want to really take a few minutes to just see how everyone is doing. Danny, we're super glad that you have returned to us. I know your schedule has been a little, wonky and conflicting with the show, which is perfectly understandable. But please tell us, what have you been up to?
A lot. 2020 did the absolute most in my life in the last 2.5 months. So in the time since I've seen you all last, I've moved again, for the second time since the pandemic started. So I'm back in PG County, Laurel, yay, where everyone lives, Laurel or Bowie. And then, work is going well. I'm adopting my own dog this week. Basically, I started my whole life over with 2021. The only thing that is the same about my life is my job. So that's great news. But I'm glad to be back. I'm glad to be alive, glad to see all of your faces. There are people and friends in this world. So, quarantine life has been rough too. So, yeah.
Definitely. Well, we're glad you're okay, and especially now. I know it must be difficult to move, so super happy you're able to find which I can, from what I can see, a really nice spot. And super quick, Garrison, Mike, Esther, Adrian, please quickly, Garrison, if you want to start, just tell us what you've been up to, how you're doing, and then we'll get started with the rest of the show.
Yo, I'm good. It's good to see y'all. It's good to see you, Danny. I don't know why it's been like forever. I kind of sort of talked to everybody else, but it's like, oh, Danny, I haven't seen Danny in a long time. So it's good to see y'all.
Life's good. Married life is still dope. Yeah, things are good. Things are good. So happy to see you guys. Matthew, appreciate you being able to be here. I know it was last minute, but like Jordan said, we interacted through a lot online. And so we felt that you could provide a lot of insights. We appreciate to have you here, bro.
Thanks for the invite, man.
Excellent. And Mike, how about you?
I'm all right, man. How y'all doing? It's good to be back with y'all. Yeah, I'm fine. Sure. We'll go with fine.
Good.
2021 off to a splendid start. So, yeah, excited to be back with y'all.
Excellent. And very glad that you mentioned 2021 because it feels like this happened a month ago. But this was just last week. Some explosive events happened, and I was able to just kind of get a quick rundown and timeline. So we just recap everyone on what went down. So if you are just joining us, again, welcome back to Affirmative Interaction Season 2. If you're watching, thank you so much for watching. In the comments, please let us know where you're watching from. And we are excited to interact with you guys once again. And of course, feel free to drop any comments. So last week, Wednesday, and what date was that? January 6, 2020. Early in the morning, crowds gathered near the White House to wait to hear Trump speak. Oh, yeah, 2021. Sorry. It feels like 2020 season 2. Anyway, early in the morning, crowds gathered near the White House to wait to hear Trump speak. By noonday, Trump begins his 1 hour plus speech, falsely claiming election fraud. Then the crowds gathered outside the Capitol at 12:30. And this is actually interesting. This is what I realized when I was going through this timeline that Mike is looking at right now. And that crowds were actually starting to gather before Trump ordered people at the rally that he was speaking at to go to the Capitol. So people were already there. The energy was already there. The things were already building up even before Trump finished his speech and essentially told people to march down Pennsylvania Ave. Mike, if you want to scroll down a little bit, that's early morning. If you guys can see that, that's Trump speaking. If you go down a little bit more, I think, yeah, perfect. 12:30. So at about 1 o'clock, the initial wave of Trump supporters, they started to break through the barricade that, the small little fencing that was around the Capitol. They started to break through, and that's when they began to run into conflict with the police. By 1:10, this is when Trump urges his followers to march down Pennsylvania Ave towards the Capitol. As you can see here in the video, this is before Trump commanded folks to get to the Capitol. So things were already happening. Clearly, this was already planned. Intent was very much clear. And then Trump followers marched to the Capitol. And from what I can understand, what we can see, they then joined the people that were already there and essentially made this gigantic mass of Trump supporters pushing through into the Capitol. By that time, they start to easily overwhelm the police, and they start to make their way to the steps, climbing over, getting to wherever they could to get through the entranceway. And this is only at 2:15. And again, while this is all happening, Congress is still meeting. They're still talking. They're still confirming the votes and finishing the process of Joe Biden officially being the next president of the United States while all of this chaos is happening just right outside. By 2:15, the mob breaches the Capitol and the doors open and everyone starts rushing in. And then lastly, we'll just stop here. by 2:20, Congress adjourns and they begin to evacuate for, of course, their own safety, and they begin to shelter in place. So literally just in a couple of hours, you could see that our democracy was almost, not to sound inflammatory, but it was almost destroyed. And from what you can see in this article, as this is all happening, Trump is tweeting, he's encouraging, and he's complaining about the fraud, again, which has not been proven, apparent fraud in this election. So guys, I mean, I know where I was when this was going on. I remember being in the group chat and Garrison actually said, no, this is not really happening. This can't be real. So I kind of just brushed it off because I just feel like, maybe something popped off. It's not that serious. But then my partner texts me and she's like, yo, do you understand? Do you know what's going on? I turn on the TV and you just see a mass of people driving into the Capitol. So Matthew, we'll actually start with you. What was your initial entryway into understanding what was happening on that fateful day?
So last week, actually continuing out of this week, it's kind of been a stressful time for my family personally. We had kind of a little bit of a medical scare with my oldest son. And so we were kind of just lying low at home. I mean, we're at home a lot anyway because of the pandemic, but I was trying to stay home and just be there to support my family. And so I was actually watching C-SPAN at the time this all started happening, because I was watching, this was when Congress was starting the certification of the Electoral College vote. And so at one point, I could see like a bunch of people like get up from their seats and like kind of not run, but very quickly like move out the doors. But then some of them came back in. And so it wasn't clear exactly like what was going on, but there was a lot of activity inside the House chamber because I was watching the live stream of the House deliberation. And then at some point they suspended debate at that was the chair's decision to suspend the debate, and then they cut to the C-SPAN commentator, who I don't remember who it was, and then they started explaining that what was happening was that some of these protesters had actually gotten inside the Capitol, but at that time we didn't have any footage of what was actually happening, except for that they had a feed inside the House chamber, but at that point. They at least on C-SPAN, they weren't showing the outside of the Capitol. You couldn't see the crowds, the massive crowd that was actually there trying to break in. And so the full gravity of what was actually happening didn't really set in right away for me. Like I knew it was serious, but it wasn't. I mean, it wasn't really even until the days after that when some of the worst videos started coming out, where you could actually see the mob, beating police officers. And breaking down the doors or the windows to get into the Capitol. Like it does kind of feel in some ways like it was a slow build, like realizing just how violent this mob actually was. But even without knowing all that, just watching what I was seeing on C-SPAN and just mostly hearing the discussion from the commentators on there about what was going on at the Capitol. Like it was surreal. Like it just to think that this, and it's not that it necessarily surprised me that this group of people could be capable of something like that. It was so horrifying to see it actually happen. There's a difference between realizing that something is possible and actually seeing it, happen, almost in front of your eyes. So yeah, it was extremely shocking and disturbing that that we, like you said, we came so close. And again, this is something that I didn't realize until somewhat after the fact. But I mean, there were moments when there were rioters like seconds away from getting inside some of the areas inside the Capitol building where government leaders were sheltering. So I feel like it's just for the grace of God that this wasn't much worse than it actually was. when you actually think about what could have happened. I mean, if these rioters had actually been able to lay hands on legislators, like, I don't know, it's crazy. It's crazy.
I think you really drive that point home, because you're absolutely right. They very well could have gotten their hands, and they had plans to. I remember Adrian sent me a picture of a guy with those, what are they called? Wrist ties, or it's a plastic you would use. Yeah, exactly. Zip ties. Thank you. Clear there was some intent there, and it's wild to think that really could have happened. The possibility was there. Garrison, I feel like you want to share something.
No. I mean, I did share in the group that Simone can't be here. She has a really busy week, but we were there. We went down there to check it out, because it was really supposed to just kind of be this big rally. So we're going to kind of walk around the periphery and kind of see what we could see. But like not long after we got there, they breached the Capitol, and so there were people who were running in both directions. People who were running towards the Capitol to go in. People who were coming from that direction, basically saying like they just stormed the Capitol. They just stormed the Capitol. And so it was a really crazy thing to witness this thing with your own eyes. What's interesting is, like, I never saw anyone with any guns, because you're not supposed to kind of open carry in DC, as far as I know. And so I never saw guns. And so when Adrian shared the tweet about shots being fired inside the chamber, I just did not want to believe that at all. But the environment, being there in person, was it was crazy. It didn't feel unsafe, to be totally honest with you, until afterward, and you start to see what's actually going on inside. I mean, even up until today, people are saying that the American people have not gotten a clear picture of what actually happened. They're using the terms seditious insurrection to describe what was taking place, which means it was a coordinated effort to overthrow the government, which is just insane. But yeah, that's that.
Yeah, I think what Garrison kind of alluded to is what you, in some ways, like, you kind of see the power that media has over like travesties like this, because depending on where you're getting your sources from, that in some ways will dictate how you're comprehending like the severity of this moment, right? Like we're on social media, we're seeing the Twitter videos, we're seeing the tweets, Congress people, they're like posting, videos of like what's happening, what they're hearing. Then you had people like CNN who, like, they love the sensational story. So they're trying to make sure that what is going on. And then like you turn over to like Fox News, and like literally the headline is like Trump asks protesters to remain peaceful, right? Like that is the narrative that they're attempting to kind of stay with. And so like, once again, that we've seen throughout like the last like 4 years, like two realities are being created based off of where you're getting your information from. And like Matthew said, the more information that you keep getting, if you are truly in tune to like how frightening this is, like Chris Hayes did a really good job at showing a lot of unseen clips, and then he broke down everything that was happening in there. We saw a lot of articles from the Times, from the Hill, talking about things that are like truly frightening about not just politicians, but like Congress people that were actually there present, helping fund, the protest at the original, how it started. Yeah, like it is frightening to see. And then you hear the stories about like off-duty cops coming involved. I feel like when people are trying to like debate about this online, the people who are in the like alternative reality that I would describe, it's almost as if they're just kind of like saying we're just in like a semantics battle with them, right? Like they want to call it a riot, and like we actually want to call it what it actually is. And that, I think, is probably the more frightening thing, is that you're still going to have a large portion of the country that will never accept how terrifying those few hours actually were, because they don't want to accept that this group of people, even with history backing them up, is capable of that kind of violence.
Yeah, real quick, did you all see the Representative Lauren Boebert? I'm not sure if I'm saying her last name right, but she's one of the Republican congressional representatives. Did you see where she was live tweeting during the Capitol siege, like Speaker Pelosi's whereabouts? Like when Pelosi was whisked away, like she's like, yeah, Nancy Pelosi has left the building or whatever. Like you're in the middle of an attack on the Capitol, and she's like live tweeting, like, you know, what's happening with the Speaker of the House. Like, so there are some, and I'm not saying that she was in on it. I'm just saying there are some questions about the level of knowledge and cooperation that may have been happening between some of these right-wing representatives and the organizers of the protest.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's honestly, like, for me, the disconnect that I'm seeing is really scary. It's interesting because it seems like a lot of Trump supporters online are, you know, hashing this up to be just like, oh, some people were kind of upset about an election that I even agree to be fraudulent. But like, when you've watched some of these videos, these people are chanting "Hang Mike Pence," and like,
yeah,
I don't know if they were going to hang Mike Pence, but I would say that I would trust a group of people yelling "Hang Mike Pence," trying to break into the place that Mike Pence is, that they might actually want to hang Mike Pence. But it's been weird to see this gymnastics, and I feel like this like legislator that you're speaking to kind of speaks to some of that disconnect, where a lot of people are like, we're blocking freedom of speech now because we've like banned Trump from social media, and that's like harmful to us as a society. And I'm like, well, if you actually dig into some of this stuff, these people that are saying things like "Hang Mike Pence" went immediately to Parler and were planning physical violent attacks on lawmakers, looking to harm and even kill people that they thought were overthrowing an election. So maybe we're saying like, oh, Donald Trump, he was just like wanting to win. But it's like, the problem is that he's encouraging his supporters to be not only like militantly angry against the election results, but then take that militant anger and actually try to kill someone. And in this result, they killed a cop, like very willingly killed a police officer at the Capitol. But it's so interesting. I've seen so many like Trump supporters try to be like, well, this is just comparing to the Black Lives Matter protests, or riots are all very similar, or this is an infringement on freedom of speech. And I'm like, well, maybe to you, but this is literally safety and care.
Oh, nah. QAnon hacking our stuff, bro.
Oof, new job, same internet.
Why you doing that?
But yeah, like that's the, like, I don't want Mike Pence to die by an angry mob. Like I don't want Donald Trump to get killed by an angry mob. Like these things might be results of some of these like things, but it's, people aren't realizing actually how terrifying some of these. And I saw someone make that status today. What's worse, the infringement on freedom of speech that never has taken place? No one's freedom of speech is being removed. Donald Trump could at any moment put himself on national TV like that and ask to be heard, but you know, he's wanting to cry because he wants his followers to be mad. He doesn't actually want truth to be spread. But people are like, what about the infringement on freedom of speech or an angry mob looking to kill you? And I'm like, I think your Facebook page might be better dying at the hands of an angry mob. But I don't know. I'm just a libtard. I don't know.
Yeah, so I mean, I found out honestly pretty late because I mean, I have a job where, like, you literally cannot, like, I don't know what's happening at all during the day. I go the whole day like it's just me and my 27-7-year-olds on Zoom all day. So I found out pretty late, like when they sent out the alert about the 6 p.m. curfew. And then I checked the news and they were like, oh, by the way, Pence is being evacuated. And I was like, oh, wait, like what's going on? I literally ran in like, Adrian, guess what? And he was like, yeah, I know. Like I've been watching it on the news for like the past hour. And I was like, oh, okay. But honestly, my first thought, like for the first few hours, I was really just like laughing at how incredible it was that we were watching this happen and watching the law enforcement response, which in hindsight, now after getting more information, I'm still suspicious of it, but I also see in the videos that clearly those police officers were outnumbered and terrified, like they were terrified.
Yeah.
But my very first thought was like, this is really interesting to see because I remember last summer in July, I was out protesting, not here in DC, but in Indianapolis. But I know the same thing happened in DC. And like, we were literally violently attacked for just standing in the street. Like that literally is what happened. We were standing in the street and we were violently attacked by police and forcefully dispersed fairly quickly. And I was like, that is so crazy. Like, we're just watching all these people just like, you know, run in and out of the building. I'm not seeing any tear gas. I'm not seeing any like, you know, riot gear on the cops. I'm not seeing any mass arrests. Like, this is really interesting. How crazy, how interesting it is to see the difference in these two responses was where my mind went first. And just automatically thinking about how I read an article a couple days before about how because of the protests over the summer and how the National Guard was brought in and how the public reacted to the National Guard being brought in and how they treated the Black Lives Matter protesters, that supposedly, apparently because of that, they made a decision ahead of time this time to put restrictions on the National Guard, like no military equipment, no helicopters. In fact, the National Guard, they said, you guys aren't even going to be armed. Your job is just to maintain perimeter, sort of crowd control. And then like local police, they're going to be handling the actual law enforcement and treatment of the crowd. And I was just like, this is so, it's insane to me because you think that these two are the same. Like, we've been watching people for weeks online plan how to sneak guns into DC. Like, we've been watching that happen. And you guys were like, no, let's assume the best of these people. Let's assume the best of the people who are online very loudly declaring that they want to do violent things, but we're going to give them the benefit of the doubt. And we're going to make sure that the law enforcement treats them like human beings. But last summer, you wanted to assume the worst of what were, for the vast majority, peaceful protests. And it just really showed to me how we will over and over and over and over again give white America the benefit of the doubt when they have never proven themselves to be deserving of it.
Yeah.
Never.
Yeah.
And always assume the worst of Black people when they gather. And I talked about it with my students because we didn't have school the next day. We're completely virtual. So we're not going to the building, but my school is in DC. So they said, we're going to not have school on Thursday because we realized this is a lot emotionally. Like, DC charters did that. The DCPSs did it. So we didn't have school on Thursday. So on Friday, I talked to my students because I was like, well, we just missed a whole day of school. We need to address what just happened and why. And I'm I'm asking them, and they're 7 years old. I'm like, so, what did you hear about what happened? And literally, my class of 27 Black 7-year-olds are literally typing out in the chat, I heard that if it was Black people, they would have shot us. Mm-hmm. And then all of us just having to sit with we know that it would have been different. It would have been different if if it had been us, but also pairing that with like, it would not have been us. Like there's not a history of Black people doing this. There's a history of white people when they get upset and angry and are not pleased with the decisions of law, taking matters into their own hands. That's a history that we have. We don't have that history with marginalized communities, but still just having to name, like, you are right, like it would not have been different. And having that conversation with kids that are 7 years old and watching this happen like in their backyards, it's insane.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I similar to Esther, I didn't hear about what was going on. I actually didn't know anything was happening that day until around like 4:30 when a friend of mine who lives in New Jersey texted me and said, I hope you're safe right now with everything going on. And I was like, what's happening? I've been on Zoom calls all day. And I turned on CNN, and then I was just like, oh, this is what's going on right now. Like, and by the time I had like checked in, it was when after like the glass of the Capitol building had been broken, I'm seeing people crawl out of the windows. I'm seeing Capitol Police try to like kindly guide people out of the Capitol building. And the first thing that I thought was, I was actually upset. And I texted a friend of mine and I was just like, this makes me angry, and I don't think I can watch any more of this. This blatant abuse of white privilege is disgusting to me, and I can't watch this happen on my television, let alone think about the fact that it's happening just miles away from, where my parents are working. My parents work in DC. My like grandparents live in DC. I have family that still lives there. And so just to think that this is happening right now, and nothing is being done about it was really angering to me. And then after that, I started reading. And of course, I do believe that this is something that was very carefully planned over time. I've been reading articles from NPR about just intel reports being sent to Homeland Security, for example, about this type of violent action happening on January 6th beforehand, or even President Trump saying that like January 6th was going to be something wild. Yeah. Those are in many ways just pointing to the fact that there is something happening that most Americans are not seeing. And the thing is, it's happening over the internet, because the day after, I believe, Facebook and Twitter also banned Parler, which is a web platform for alternative right folks in the country. And so obviously there's something happening where now these social media conglomerates are like, okay, let's cut down on this, because they're obviously having these conversations, even though we've known it's been going on. And the idea that this is a representation of a good portion of the country that believes they're defending democracy, right, while at the same time completely going the very foundations of what democracy is supposed to be, also showed me just how what democracy is not dependent on what's written in a book or what's written in our Constitution. It's really dependent on what white America believes democracy is. So we can go back to, this is what's in the Constitution and this is what's in our legislation. But all in all, this country was created for the people who were at the Capitol on January 6th. And the country was created to listen to their voices. And honestly, it's part of me is like, well, of course this happened. The other part of me was also making jokes, because you know how when something is so crazy, you just begin to laugh because it's so absolutely ridiculous. Yeah. And it's cynical joking, but at one point I remember telling my parents, I was like, you know, if it was Black people, they would have reinstated slavery on January 6th. Like, that's what would have happened. Or there would have just been a massacre, because this is how differently people in the United States are treated. This is how differently the motivations of certain groups are treated. And to think that our country is finally seeing this is honestly terrifying. At the same time, we're still in a global pandemic. At the same time, we're waiting for inauguration to happen in 7 days. At the same time, there's a new strain of COVID that is more contagious that is coming, and the country has to plan for. So it's just like everything is happening at once, and the only thing to hope for at this point is that we can make it through inauguration, or at least to the inauguration safely. And that's, yeah, my job had a moment on Thursday, a special Zoom call to discuss what's happening, and especially to give space for people of color and Black people at my job to be able to process. And I think that there's a lot of processing that needs to continue to happen, but also there's a lot of processing that needs to happen in white spaces. And there also needs to be some very serious conversations that white folks have with other white folks right now. Because I mean, we've said it before, this is something that's not going to be solved by Black activists and Black leaders. This can only be solved by white people. Like, we've reached a point where white people started this mess, and white people are going to have to fix it, because it's clear what the issue is. And the issue has nothing to do with people of color or Black people or Indigenous folks. So yeah, that's where I am right now.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
I don't know that I have a lot to add. I mean, one of the things that, I saw like 5 people unmuted at the same time. My bad.
No, go ahead.
Like a couple things kind of jumped out at me. Like, it was kind of crazy that the mob breached the Capitol at 2:15, and they didn't tweet out that the National Guard was coming until 3:36. It's just like, what took them so long, bro? The first wave of people that came, the first wave of the National Guard came without weapons. It just is really just like it's really even comic. It's almost like you feel stupid even reading it. It's like, that can't be right, like it can't be real. You know what I'm saying? Like, whoever like crafted that tweet, that has to just be playing, bro. Like, it can't. Like, I've said this in other conversations I've had about this. 9/11 happened when I was in high school, and so like my movement around the country was really heavily shaped by the difference between pre 9/11 and post 9/11. And I mean, I don't know that I've ever gotten on a plane here at South Bend, Indiana, without getting like searched, like an extra search, until I finally like ponied up the money to get that pre-clearance, because I was just sick of it. I was like, let me just pay this money so I can get that TSA pre-check and be smooth. Anytime I've gone to the nation's capital after 9/11, there was a law enforcement presence, like on a random day. You know what I mean? Like, it wasn't. I never had any thoughts of getting anywhere close to these buildings, let alone breach them. When I was working in New York City, I would take the PATH train, which would go right under One World Trade Center, and there was National Guard, military, like all over the place, just at all times. You know what I mean? So I'm just really confused, and I don't know that I'll ever not be confused. I don't know that there's any legitimate, rational explanation for them to be so unprepared. I mean, the amount of surveilling that the FBI and CIA does, particularly of Black people, for them to not have seen the tweets, the Facebook, I mean, they're creating whole new social media platforms like Parler just so they could talk about this stuff. It's not so they could just like share, you know, Joe Biden memes. Like they're planning stuff, bro, like actively. And all of us on here know that. How do the people that are supposed to be protecting us, how are the people that are supposed to be protecting a joint session of Congress and the vice president not know that? It's really, I mean, you know, I'm trying not to, there's a lot of like conspiracies floating out there about there being inside help or whatever the case may be. But all I'm going to say is that like something was up, man. And it could, as a couple other people have said, it could have gotten a lot worse than it was. Like when I saw the Capitol get breached and the limited amount of law enforcement presence that was there, I actually turned it off. I was like, I don't want to watch this, bro. Like it might get really ugly. Like they're inside the building. They didn't go in there to just like take a group selfie. You know what I'm saying? Like you don't breach a Capitol building to just say you did it. There's maybe a couple people in there that just were wanting to do that, but people were trying to do some damage. Like they were in there to forcefully take back what they thought was theirs. And I just feel like the response has been, it's been mild at best. That's what's probably more disappointing. It's really been mild at best. I'm disappointed with the commentary about how this isn't who we are. Like, what America have you grown up in, bro? Like, this is absolutely who we are. It's always been who we've been. And maybe this is just like a really uncomfortable, violent visual of who we are that you don't like seeing on national TV. But this has always been who we are, bro. Like, this is quite clearly America. And I feel like the fact that, you know, we've been spending like the better part of 5 years in response to Trumpism versus campaign and then being elected, like the entire time, like trying to tell ourselves that like it wasn't real, when, I mean, Black people have known it's real, you know, and there'd be times where it's like really confusing, but then you remember like, oh yeah, we're in America. Like that's actually pretty normal, you know? And I feel like the longer that politicians in both political parties continue to proliferate this narrative of this being an outlier as opposed to the problem, like the actual root of who we are as a country, until they are interested in reckoning with that and looking in the mirror and really saying, hey, look, we don't like that this is part of who we are, but it absolutely is. And until we begin to acknowledge that, nothing's really going to change. Like we may have, it's going to be up and down. Like we'll maybe have a couple of years where it feels like, oh, okay, we got some cool legislation, things are starting to get done. And then that fever pitch of a presidential campaign stokes up again, and all these people come right back out the closet. So I don't see it going anywhere unless we take some really strong direct action as a nation. And we've never had the stomach for that, so I don't anticipate us to do it. So obviously, as Danielle said, I hope we can get on the other side of the inauguration and just like have a second to breathe, like to just like catch our breath and not have to like be, you know, frantically like picking up our phones every 2 seconds. Like what happened 2 seconds ago? Like, is everything still okay in the world? It'd be nice to be able to just kind of have some modicum of peace, but it won't last for long if we don't take some really strong direct action to really overturn the way we fundamentally operate as a nation. And that's not likely, sadly.
Yeah. And I do think a lot of that has to do with the way we're having these conversations. I mean, you know, what happened at the Capitol has never happened in the history. Nothing like that has ever happened in the history of this country. And the way we normalize these activities, like what happened at the Capitol, the siege, the insurrection, sedition, whatever you want to call it, the way you normalize that is by trying to directly compare it to other things. you actually lessen the severity of what happened at the Capitol when you try to say, well, they didn't do anything when Black Lives Matter was protesting over the summer. But the reality is that there is absolutely no comparison whatsoever to be made between the actions of the individuals who may have looted, who may have burned vehicles or cars, who even burned a police station. There's actually no comparison between that terrible action that none of us agree with, right? And what happened at the Capitol. They're fundamentally different in their intent, and even in the level of organization. When you have angry people run into the streets and bust the windows out of a car, it is fundamentally different than when you have people planning 4 weeks to overthrow the government on January 6th. I actually have a group of people who probably don't know that I do this, but I'm friends with several QAnon followers, several far right-wing individuals on Facebook who I routinely go and I check their pages. I interact a little bit every now and again with their comment sections or what have you, just to keep that stuff in my algorithm so that I can see what they're talking about. And for the last several weeks, they've been saying, and I quote, "The storm is coming." Now, I had no clue that the storm is coming could potentially mean that they be storming the Capitol. I had no idea, but I have reason to believe that they knew what they were saying. I think they knew. And so I definitely think that we are cheapening the severity of this event when people who are actively trying to make comparisons, and these are pastors who I've seen doing this, trying to make the comparison between what happened last week, Wednesday, to the events over the summer.
One of the things I find interesting about this whole thing, I mean, really the whole Trump movement, not just what happened last week, but the Trump movement in general, is how it has kind of brought together these different groups on the right. And I mean, that's true of any successful political coalition. They have to unite different groups of people in order to win elections and achieve their goals. But if you look at the people who are behind Trump, you know, we talk a lot about white evangelicals. You can talk about now the QAnon crowd, but there's another element there, and that is the actual avowed white supremacists, like the neo-Nazis and the KKK, not just the people where it's under the surface, you know, where it's subtler, it's implicit, but the people who are explicit in their white supremacy. And I think that for the average conservative and probably even the average Trump supporter, they don't realize the influence that those people have had on the pro-Trump movement. And this is why they can get away with this conspiracy theory that, it was actually Antifa, right? It was actually Antifa that stormed the Capitol. They were disguised as Trump supporters. It was a false flag operation to make us look bad. But we would never do that. You know, it's easy to believe that because we all see ourselves as the good guy, right? If I'm a Trump supporter, I'm the good guy, and I would never do that at the Capitol. So it's easy to believe that. But another reason why it's easy for them to believe that is they don't know who these people are that are leading these movements on the ground. I mean, we know who it was because some of these far right leaders, they were inside the Capitol taking selfies and live streaming themselves. Like they documented themselves and committing a crime. It's crazy to think about, but this is actually what happened. And so you have Baked Alaska was there. Nick Fuentes was there. But you know what? If you ask I lay you odds, if you ask the average Trump voter, especially in the older demographic, who those guys are, they don't have a clue. They don't know who those people are. And so it's easy for them to think, oh yeah, it's Antifa. That guy in the Jake Angelin with the horned hat, right? They don't know who he is. The QAnon shaman, they don't know who he is. But these are the people that have been influencing the conversation on the right, and so that element of white supremacy has come into. I mean, it's been there all along, but that far right avowed white supremacist influence is there in the Trump movement, and a lot of Trump supporters and conservatives don't realize that it's had that influence. But this has kind of been their goal all along. If you look at what these white supremacists say when they talk about their plans, they want to influence the more moderate conservatives in America with their white supremacist ideology. And one of the ways they do that is to spread this fear, this anxiety that we're going to be replaced, right? I mean, it's only a matter of time. Demographically, eventually, it's going to happen that white people are the numerical minority. One way or another, that's going to happen. And so that's that undercurrent of fear is what's driving a lot of this extreme action that we now see them taking. There's a whole lot of other stuff that plays into it too. But when you see this, desperation, that talk about, oh, if we don't do something, we're going to lose our country. This is part of what they're talking about. It's that sense that if we don't take action now, if we don't regain control of the levers of power of our country, then we've lost it forever. It's this enraged and terrified reaction from people who realize they're losing their grip on power and privilege, and they're doing everything they can to just cling to it for dear life.
Yeah, and I would just want to continue with what he's saying here, because I think it's very important for us to also mention this. It's not just those caricatures that Matt is referring to. It's also a lot of politicians that have made a very intentional effort in riling up their base for what they believe will turn into, let's say, a high voter turnout for them, a re-election for them, political capital for them. Let me enrage this particular demographic so that they can see me as a savior for the problems that I keep telling them are existing for them, right? And then you see that picture of that one white guy, like he's put up his fist to the rioters out in the front. You had people like Ted Cruz, Holly, like they're in the chamber, like it's crazy how you can hear Ted Cruz say things like, well, the reality is, 48% of the country believes the election is stolen. But it's like, Ted, they literally only believe it because you keep telling them that this election is stolen. You created a problem that would enrage them, and then they took that rage, and then you told them that you would be the one to save them, right? You went into that Capitol and you stood up as a person that is going to be the last hope of democracy, right? While you had people like Trump saying, we're going to be there, we're going to march down on Washington. And the irony is, when those people got inside the Capitol, Ted, why did you hide? Trump, why were you not there? If you are their saviors, if you are the people, if you're with the people, why are you hiding once they've gotten inside? You should have nothing to fear. And what's frustrating is, over and over, like Esther was saying earlier, like the benefit of the doubt that a lot of white Americans have, it's also like you don't take their violence seriously enough. And that, I think, is the scariest part when it comes to politicians, is that particularly in the Republican Party, they are willing to exploit white rage for like their own political capital, for their own gain. They're willing to spread misinformation, the race baiting, the dog whistling. They're willing to go that far because they believe that is what will help them in their political career. When you had people like Matt Gaetz comparing it to Black Lives Matter, clearly lying about Antifa, saying that the Democrats were literally burning the streets, it's like, well, what are you are painting a reality for these grievanced white Americans that does not exist. It doesn't exist. But you keep perpetuating it. You perpetuate it. It gets them angrier and angrier. And for the last 4 years, you had so many people, predominantly people of color, telling you, listen, this is going to end in violence if you keep on tapping onto that button. And they didn't believe it. They didn't believe it. And then finally, when it happens, it's like the people who are experiencing it the firsthand are now all of a sudden awakened to the reality of white violence in our country. When people for years had been telling them it has existed, and the methods that you have continued to use is going to unleash that rage. We've been telling them that over and over. I saw that this funny article that I remember Esther and I were talking about, where these white off-duty cops were just outraged at the idea that some of their off-duty colleagues were there within the riot storming the Capitol. And then this one guy had this quote of like, if they're willing to do this when they're off duty, imagine what they're doing when they're in their uniform. And we're literally like, Black people have been telling you guys this for literally decades. Why did it take your own suffrage for you to finally take these things seriously? And that I think is the most frustrating. It's like these politicians, they are tapping on dangerous waters when they keep thinking that at the end of the day, it's no big deal. Like that one politician was like, what's the harm in humoring Trump? Well, literally, this is the harm, or at least some of the harm that can come when you humor something like this. And that is like, man, like, I think I very much agree with what Danny was saying. Like, this is not like white people need to fix this. I don't know how you do something with a predominantly white Republican Party who, from what I've seen, the majority of them have no interest in backing away on their methods. It's full within Congress. They're all using the same tactics, the same methods, and you're just walking away like you all almost lost your life just about a week ago by tapping into that white violence. And then the impeachment hearing took place today, and you are literally using the same tactics again. I don't understand. It's just like madness to me. And like this is where it's like I had to tune out, because it's like y'all are insane. It's like you needed a tragedy in order for you to take it seriously, and then you just forgot so quickly.
It really is crazy when you think about it, that I mean, even the Republicans in Congress, like, their lives were endangered by this mob that broke in, and still, like, the tone hasn't changed. I mean, some of them it has, but a lot of them not. And I don't get that. Like, how are you more afraid of angering these people by speaking the truth than you are that, you know, they might form another mob and come and attack you? Like, it doesn't make any sense to me.
I also think, I think we need to rethink the way we talk about white privilege, because there's always a danger in inciting fear in any group of people, but there's a very distinct and particular fear in inciting fear within white America because of the historical buildup that we have that creates white privilege. And I think we need to start to tie history together when we talk about race in a very complete way, and talk about how things that happened and decisions that were made like decades and decades and decades ago have echoes in our society that people act on, right? Like, I've been listening to this podcast that talks about these different Supreme Court decisions, and they talk about the Dred Scott case, and how, you know, it's obviously been like, the Supreme Court has obviously, you know, now, like, Dred Scott case no longer has standing, but like that famous sentence in that decision where they said, like, the white man in America, or the black man in America, has no rights that the white man is required to respect. Like, they said that, right? That was coming from our government, like an official stance that, like, has echoes in how people are going to act, right? And we have this history of seeing how white people repeatedly have been, like, they believe they're above the law because they've been told they're above the law. Like, because historically they have been above the law. Like, we have to start to tie all of these things together and recognize that when you have a group of people that have a history of being entitled and given the ability to do things that are against the law without repercussion for centuries, that doesn't die out. And that has to be part of our conversation about white privilege and why we see like these types of acts of violence coming from this like a specific demographic, right? Like when we're talking about mass shootings, when we are talking about like insurrections, like those actions are coming from a specific demographic of people because there is a historical pattern of them being able to do things and them using this as their outlet when they are upset and feeling threatened and afraid. And so when you're inciting fear in that group of people, that you can't be surprised when they act out in the ways that they have been able to act out in the past.
Right.
So like I think it also has to be about just, I mean, like what you were saying earlier, Nix, of like, we need to reckon with our history in a real and honest way. And we can't shy away from it for fear of being partisan or alienating people. We have to be honest that like, these are facts. Like, this isn't an opinion to say that white people in this country have been empowered with the ability to break the law and do insanely violent things without repercussions. And so they continue to do them. That's not a radical statement. That's just historically true. And we need to be acting out of that understanding all the time. If we were doing that, things like this would never, like, they wouldn't shock us. We would be prepared for them. We would expect them. And perhaps some people who are using this tactic and rhetoric would maybe think twice and understand, like, doing this is inevitably going to have violent consequences, because that is the history of America and the history of this specific group of people when they're afraid.
No, that's like so good. I mean, and it's funny because is what happens whenever you have a history of the country that ascribes to that idea that white privilege exists to the point that white people can break the law, tell lies, and fabricate information to get away with anything. You can then elect a historically accurate president like Donald Trump. And it's funny because we've literally been saying that exact thing since Donald Trump like kind of came onto the scene, and we've been like, wait, this guy doesn't tell the truth. This guy lies. We've tried to impeach him. We've now impeached him twice for it. We could have impeached him over Russia when he was literally calling Russia or having his people call Russia to try to get them to interfere in our election. And so they did it through Facebook, which he's now finally banned from. But it's funny when you think of white privilege, like Donald Trump can sit there and lie about the results of an election and get millions upon millions of people to believe them with actually no proof. And then Donald Trump is the same person that made it a requirement for our first black president to present a birth certificate that he didn't even need to present, because you can't run for president if you're not a citizen born in America. So he had already clearly brought forth the evidence, but it's just so like telling of the scope of white privilege or whiteness or the white experience that exists in America, is that not only do we not need good information or sourced information, we can literally fabricate things and it will be skated as fact. I mean, that's the thing, is that people don't even realize that Donald Trump doesn't have to present a lick of evidence for 70 million people to believe him. Like, not 1 ounce of evidence. Because we haven't seen even like any evidence come forward to say like, yeah, there's proof of mass fraud. And it's kind of wild, the level of white privilege, because literally Barack Obama couldn't even get away with not presenting a birth certificate. Which politician's birth certificate have you ever seen other than Barack Obama's? Coincidentally, the only black president is the only person that had to present a birth certificate. That was literally unnecessary. And Donald Trump is literally got an overthrow of the government based off of the idea that the election was fraudulent, because I don't believe that Joe Biden, Sleepy Joe, could get more votes than me. And mail-in voting like hurt. It's just kind of wild. And I don't know what some of the work in the white community looks like, because at this point in 2021, if I call, like, I'm literally arguing with someone that didn't even vote for Trump in my messages right now, because she compared the Black Lives Matter protests to these. And I said, that's not a good comparison. It's anti-blackness. So she's sending me screenshots of conversations she's had with black people that tell her she's not racist. And I'm like, that's not what we're talking about here. I just want to have a conversation about how you can't compare the rhetoric. And white people are like, I don't even want to listen to that, because we've watered down this reality every day, and it's getting more challenging. And so, I mean, I'm obviously up for advice. I know some of you work in D&I and diversity and inclusion, and because I don't know, it just gets tough to hear some of the work that white people need to do. Not saying I'm not willing to do it, but I'm like, I can't even convince normal people that these things like white privilege and systemic racism exist, much less a Trump supporter. Dear Lord.
So thank you for bringing that up, Logan, because I do want to ask, this is what happened at the Capitol last week was definitely, I would say, the culmination of, just like what Matthew said so well, it's really the culmination of white people realizing that the power that they have in this country is slipping away each and every day. And people that look like you and I, people of color, we are going to be arresting more and more power. And I would say we're not taking it. We're essentially reclaiming what is rightfully ours, what should be rightfully shared across with everyone in this country. So now I wonder, Joe Biden, he will be president. Now I wonder, what is our path forward going to look like? Are we about changing people's minds? Are we about having conversations and educating people into having a different mindset, into looking at things differently? Or are we about taking the new opportunities that we have in the government by flipping the Senate, having the House, having the presidency, and making change that pushes our progressive agendas forward? So what do you guys think about that? What do you think the way forward is going to look like?
I think there's multiple things. And honestly, at this point, I don't think it's going to be something that starts within the government. I think that the past couple of years have really bred such a deep mistrust of government, legislators, the executive branch. Like, it really needs to be something that's happening within communities. In our chat, we've been talking just about a little bit about what is next. And to follow up on what Logan was saying, some of this is because of a lack of both formal and informal education. Like, we can't expect something different if no one is being taught something different. Whether it's in schools, we're not being taught history in a way that is actually reflective of American history. In homes, white kids are not being taught what it means to be white in America and what that looks like. White kids gain their identity from going on the internet now and looking at the thousands and thousands of alt-right websites that are radicalizing white kids in the United States as we speak. And the Anti-Defamation League has known this for years. Like, this is not a new thing. It's just coming at its peak because those kids are finally able to do things on their own. It comes from, just like Black kids get the talk, white parents having the talk with their kids and saying, like, this is the country we live in. And this is what some white people will say your identity is and what it's founded on. But this is what your identity actually is founded on. And then I think it comes also from churches. I've been virtually attending All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church in DC. And on Sunday, the minister there, Reverend Catherine Rollins, she gave a phenomenal sermon. I was like in my house, like, preach white woman. She was calling things out for what they are. And even with white liberals, because white liberals don't have it right either. Like, as a white liberal woman, she called out the majority white liberal church for what needed to be done. And she called to the white people in that congregation to say, this is the reality of our country, and it's a reality we have tried to be ignorant of for so long. And this is what needs to be done. And so their theme for the month is reparations and reformation. And so right after that service, their anti-racism group at their church hosted a talk with the local DC org about reparations. And it's just like, that's the kind of stuff that needs to happen. You need white communities to really take ownership over this and being able to do this education, teach kids, teach their friends and families, and not be afraid to say, we need to shape our identity. You know, like, no, what does it mean to be white? What does it look like to be a white person in this country? What does it look like to understand the construct of whiteness? What does it mean to be able to say, I'm going to choose to live in a way that empowers other people? Like, while my color does give me an advantage, I'm going to use that for the advantage of other people as well. Like, I just think white Americans are in an identity crisis. When you realize you are not able to just do whatever the hell you want, you have an existential crisis, and their existential crisis kills a bunch of people. And now it's time to say, you know what? Who are we? Let's take control of this, and let's actually make a difference.
I think the thing is, like, most white people never even think about that, though, because we're so ingrained in, like, it's just natural for us to see our culture as defined by us as normal, right, good, the standard, whatever. You know, we don't even think about these things in any of the ways that you've just described, which we absolutely should, but we don't, because we don't have to. When I share my story, kind of how I, you know, went from where I was as a kid growing up in predominantly white communities and white churches, to getting to where I am today and having the understanding that I have today, I talk about the privilege of ignorance and how there were so many of these facets of life in America that I never had to think about, like interacting with the police, like, you know, the fact that there were advantages that I enjoyed in my upbringing, my childhood, and my youth that other people, you know, didn't have, and that race was a factor in why they didn't have it. I didn't have to think about those things. It was never required of me. And in fact, unless I had made the conscious choice to think about those things, I could have continued living my life in blissful ignorance. So there really is a privilege to that, to not having to worry about those things. And so that's where a lot of white people are, even into adulthood. I did make the choice when I was in college and in graduate school to actually think about these issues and to consider the perspectives of people who'd had a different life in this country than I've had. But a lot of people don't make that choice, or they never had even going to university like I did was an opportunity that some people don't have. Even white people don't have that opportunity sometimes. And so they continue to live their life never thinking about these things. And I think that's part of where we start if we want to make progress on these issues, is to help white people to think about these issues. And it's not easy because some of them don't want to, and some of them are never going to think about these things. But I think that we can make progress with some who are willing to open their eyes and to see that their life experience is not shared by everybody. And there are things that they have, privileges that they have enjoyed in this country because they are white. But it's definitely a process. It's not going to happen instantaneously.
I also wanted to add, like to what you were saying, Danny, about the importance of like having these conversations with like in our schools and like the infrastructures that we have, since we can't rely on individual people and parents and to make that decision. We need like systemic ways to make sure that this happens and to make sure that people are thinking about what it means to be white, so that they're not having to like choose whether or not they do it in their young adulthood, which is another, like, again, we cannot rely on people individually making the right choices. That just doesn't work. But like when we talk about the importance of education and education reform and how we teach history and how we talk about whiteness in our schools, sometimes that can feel like a very like abstract idea, like very like far off in the future, unattainable. But like, I just want to bring to people's attentions that like there are very concrete ways that we decide what is taught in schools at local levels. Like there are specific standards that are like adopted in counties and districts that are adopted by boards of education and like required in schools. Like that, like the system of introducing new standards and pieces of content into schools is like a very concrete system that happens on local levels in boards of education and rooms like that are actually like very accessible like to the public. And so like it's like it feels like very lofty when you think about it because our school system has been the way it is for so long. But like we have seen in recent years very like there have been some pretty major shifts in what we teach in schools. Like we have seen schools and districts across the country required to talk about consent in their like health education. That's a huge shift, and that has been happening. So like this is a doable, actionable thing. Like this can happen on local levels. I'm just thinking of like what it would mean to have standards that are like students will be able to define what it means to be a white person in America, how white privilege is observable in our everyday lives. Like those are standards that can be written and implemented in schools, and there will definitely be pushback in lots of places. But I just want to say like it's not as abstract as it feels to get things like that done. Like that is a very doable thing.
And I wanted to kind of continue what Matt was saying, because I think there is some slight relatability, just like in the upbringing that I had, and something that we're saying in the chat of like so much of the Black experience is just like not being taught in like books, whether it's K through 12 or even higher ed's like required courses. So it's like so much of the information that like I personally gained was through like social media, right? Was through like a friend posting an article or my friend making a tweet that I said, I've never heard that term before or that phrase before. Let me go research that. And I remember at the end of our, like Andrew's experience, and we had the rite of passage ceremony. And like part of the requirement was you as a Black person who has had the privilege of being able to attain a certain level of education, you then bring the knowledge and the resources you have back to the community of the people who weren't able to get that same academic experience. And I do wonder where, for many white Americans who do have the privilege in making it into the college experience, that same responsibility should then be asked of them. There are going to be white people in your family who will not be able to go to, the second most diverse school in the nation, where you're going to be interacting with a lot of Black college students that have some knowledge on this that will expand your worldview. And so once you have that paradigm shift, that same call back to your community, I think, should be required of them also, because your white family, the peers that you have, the siblings, your parents, your grandparents, there are possibilities where, many of them won't get that privilege of what tends to come at that college experience, where you're finally exposed to so much vast information. And I don't know if that responsibility has always been posed, that should be exclusive for the degree earned white American class, because so much of the teaching does fall directly on Black people, but that college educated white kid is going to have access into spaces with their family and their back home communities that we will never really be able to connect with. And so that responsibility should also be on them.
Yeah, I can't speak for other degrees. Just as a theology major, we definitely have that perspective, not necessarily in relation to race, but the idea that we go to get an education so that we can go back to local congregations and be a theologian in the church, and we can share with the people in our congregations what we've learned, and even share with them the tools for how to learn. So I definitely agree with you. I think that there is a way that those of us who have college degrees can do that with respect to issues of race. That we and certainly a college education is not the only thing needed to become informed about these issues, because we've been discussing this in the chat too, but a lot of the things that I learned about racial issues, I learned outside of the classroom. But then again, a lot of it was also in the environment of the university. Maybe it was conversations with classmates in the hallway or something like that. But there are opportunities to share that with people who haven't had that experience. They've not been to university where they've rubbed shoulders with people from all over the world. And so I do think that can become one of the ways that we work for change.
Yeah, trickle down knowledge seems really important here. I know we talk about trickle down economics a lot, and how it doesn't work, but I feel like trickle down knowledge is about as important in these conversations as it gets, because when you talk about privilege, it's really important to understand is that every day that you get older, you have people that look up to you. And I speak directly to white people here. Yeah, trickle down isn't the right language. It's just a little clickbait there. But like the reality is that as we grow up, and we meaning specifically white people, you're put into places of power. And I know that we're born into privilege, but with our whiteness, we're able to get to privilege positions more importantly. And that's the problem that I struggle with, is that white people specifically don't care about anti-racist work. And if they did, I would have learned about anti-racism before a few years ago. I mean, unfortunately, not quite every single, but 95% of the teachers that I grew up with at my Christian Seventh-day Adventist Academy and at my Christian Seventh-day Adventist University, well, not a university, Union College, is still a measly college, but they didn't talk about not even any other experience, any experience. Experience was not a conversation that I was ever told about how to be anything or how it was different for someone else. I mean, I know that we learn about civil rights and Black figureheads, but we don't learn about the difference of experience that different people groups go through currently in our nation. And we barely talk about it in a historical view, even with civil rights, we talk about, oh yeah, some people were hosed down, or, we water down the history, no pun intended. But it's like, if you're in a position of authority, and every person is at some point as they get older, you're given the ability to either have children or nieces or just kids that look up to you. I feel like it's really important to push into their lives what other people live life in a way different than your own. And because in reality, like, that's going to be, I saw someone comment to me that actually has been regarded by his peers as like just a history buff. I shared his status one time, and I'm pretty sure a number of people on this podcast kind of ripped this. I'm not going to say Danny Philpott's name on here, but like just ripped him to kind of shreds. And he made this statement that, the people are arguing that they're more oppressed than other people and that all oppressors are terrible. And I was like, well, first of all, let's break this down for a second. If you're teaching the people below you that some people aren't more oppressed than others, you're insane. But I think more damaging is that a lot of white people think that oppressing people isn't a bad thing. And I think that that's actually insane, because oppression is bad. But I think it's important for us as like people in any kind of authority to actually really use that ability to push your authority onto those below you and say, like, look, you may need to look at this from a different perspective, and you may get written off. But, honestly, I think the work kind of does itself whenever you do that. I think a lot of people will write you off, but I think also a lot of people will listen, even if the louder people are the ones writing you off, trying to tell you that you're like, I don't know, somebody called me I don't even want to repeat some of these things that I've been called this week. That's not even important. But yeah, so like, I think that's a really important reality, is that if you're in any position of authority over any person, you should really be pushing a different perspective than your own, specifically a different perspective than the white perspective. Because I think even Black educators that I've had throughout my life have been forced through their curriculums to push the white perspective that's been kind of handed to them to teach. And that's, almost more just as disappointing, I guess, as a white person having to push that. But
yeah, thanks for that. I'll just add real quick, somewhat duplicative point, but just to maybe hammer it home, I can't underestimate how important it is from the educational lens to really fundamentally alter just the way that we are teaching our children about who they are, particularly white children, about who they are and their place in American society and authentic history and truth telling about that history. I think a big piece of that needs to be centered around racial identity development. And that's really for anyone. I mean, we all need to be doing that. I've been on the journey of that myself for a while. But for white people in particular, I think I've shared this on this podcast before, so I'll just share it really quickly that, for white people, there are 6 stages of racial identity development. And the first, I'm just going to talk about the first stage. The first one is called contact. And the word that is used to describe that first stage is colorblindness. And so white people at that initial stage of hearing anything about race are immediately ingrained with this idea of not seeing color. And so the scary thing about that is, again, there's 6 stages. Studies suggest and scholars suggest that over 90% of white persons never get out of stage 1. They just stay there. And anytime that they're confronted with a evidence about race or racism, there's just these embedded defense mechanisms to push back on it, to not be conscious to it, to have no awareness to it, because to have any awareness to it would be to acknowledge it as real. And they are taught at the initial stage to not give it or to not treat it as real, essentially. So obviously those numbers need to change. You know, just conversely, for persons of color, there are 5 stages, and over 50% of Black people get out of that first stage, or persons of color in particular. Black persons, it's higher than that because we have to for survival. So that just sort of should let you know how the way that our system and our country and society is structured leads to the ways that we relate to race and racism. And if those numbers don't change, these conversations over time, or we'll just a group like us will be having them, 50 years from now, if we're still around, if there's still something left of this earth to live on. So, yeah.
Thank you guys for coming onto the show and sharing your thoughts. We're just, of course, glad that everyone is safe and sound, especially after last week. Special thanks to Matthew for joining us. We are so glad to have you on. We hope you can return, and maybe, just maybe, we could just start a show with a black screen, and then out of nowhere, you're just playing a remixed hymn on the guitar. But, we could work that out later. Guys, thank you so much for watching Affirmative Interaction. We're so glad that you're able to join us, especially after our break. And please stay safe too. And of course, wear a mask and wash your hands. You can, of course, listen to our podcast version, our audio version of this show on Apple Podcasts and wherever else you get your podcast, Spotify, of course, too. And feel free to like us on Instagram, and also let us know what you would want us to talk about. Let us know the things that you would like for us to cover and what you're interested in discussing. So with that being said, thank you so much. I'm Jordan Smart. We are Affirmative Interaction, and we hope you have a good night.